Just take a second. Okay, today is Friday, July the 20th. We're at the New York State Military Museum in Saratoga Springs. The interviewer is Wayne Clark. And sir, will you please state your full name and your date of birth?
My full name is Emile Anthony Mainville. I was born October 15, 1925.
And whereabouts were you born?
I was born in Worcester, Massachusetts.
Okay, and did you attend school there, grow up there in that area?
I attended school in Worcester until I was in the 6th grade, and at that time my family moved to Leicester, which was next to Worcester. It was a suburb, I guess you would call it today. And that's where I finished my schooling. I went to grade school and high school there.
Okay. Do you remember where you were when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Yes, we were playing baseball at a field in Leicester, and we had heard that Pearl Harbor was bombed, and everybody had a plan of what they were going to do. Of all the people I was with were mostly young men around my age, and many were going to Canada, so they said, because the age for active duty up there was 17 years as opposed to 18 years here in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, prior to my going into the active duty, I had tried to join the V5 program in the Navy, and I had passed all the mental examinations for that, and the physical examination disqualified me because I did not have a perfect bite. I was interested in joining the V5 program because I had an uncle who was only a few years older than myself, who was very active in that, and he was more or less my idol and the person that I was trying to identify myself with at that time. Mm-hmm. The Navy told me that the Army would take me in spite of the bite, so I went over and took the Army mental and physical exams, which I passed, and I was joined the Army, I believe, in July of 1943, and I was called to active duty after my 18th birthday in October. They didn't waste any time.
Mm-hmm. Now, where did you go for your basic training?
I had my basic training at what they called BTC number 10 in Greensboro, North Carolina, and it was down there after about 3 months, maybe 2 months, that 90% of our class was washed out, and most of us were sent to radio engineering or armament school, and then gunnery school to become gunners.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I was sent to armament school at Lowry Field in Denver, Colorado, and then I went to gunnery school in Florida, where we trained at Fort Myers, Florida, and our training down there was on twin-engine aircraft, primarily B-25s.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you fire at towed targets, or?
Yes, we fired. We had colored bullets, and we fired at towed targets, and our results were obtained by checking the color of the that the bullet left when it went through the target.
Okay, now did you fire both on the ground and in the air?
Most of our firing was on the ground. We did a lot of skeet shooting,
Mm-hmm.
where we stood on moving trucks and fired at what they called the birds that were sent out from pits in the ground, and we took turns being in the ground, loading the guns to shoot out the clay pigeons, as they called them.
Okay. And once that schooling was completed, where did you go from there?
From there, I was given a furlough, and I then reported to Gowan Field, just outside of Boise, Idaho, where we were assigned to cruise, and we trained at Boise, Idaho, dropping bombs and practicing gunnery.
Mm-hmm. Now, the rest of your crew, were they Did they have much experience, or were they right out of school, just like yourself?
The average age of our crew at that time, I think, was about 20 or 21 years.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the crew were young fellows. Our pilot was a Jewish gentleman, and he did not wear his dog tags because of that, but he had been a pre-med student and was from Boston, Massachusetts. Our co-pilot was about the same age, and he was from Norwood, New York. There were 9 crew members. We had an engineer, a radio operator, an armorer person, which I was, and the rest were tail gunners or manned guns on the airplane.
Mm-hmm. Now, how long did your crew train in the United States before they went overseas?
I believe we trained about 3 months in the United States, and then we were sent to Camp Miles Standish in Boston, and we went overseas on a vessel, and we were united in England at a place called Tibbenham or Tibbets Hall Station, where our crew was put together, and we were at that place probably about 2 months before we actually flew a mission.
Okay.
We started flying in January of 1945, and we finished in April of 1945.
Okay, let me go back a little bit. How did you get overseas?
We went overseas on a vessel.
Mm-hmm. Did the entire crew go together?
Yes.
Okay.
Our crew went together, and we all arrived in England. It was Liverpool, I believe, where we landed, and we were put on trains, and we were sent to East Anglia, where Tibbets Hall Station was, and there we were assigned to a bomb group and a squadron.
Now, what was the name of that group and squadron?
The bomb group was the 445th Bomb Group, and our squadron that I was in was the 302nd. There were 4 squadrons there, 300, 301, 302, and for some reason I don't remember 303, I remember 304.
Mm-hmm.
And prior to my arrival there, movie actor James Stewart had been in, he was a pilot, and he flew combat missions and had a crew. And I have pictures of him at home in another book that I purchased, was put out by a gentleman who was the adjutant at our base.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were part of the 8th Air Force.
Yep. We were part of the 8th Air Force, and that was our, as I recall, there was no other Air Force in England other than the 8th. The 15th and the 12th were down around Italy or North Africa, and they bombed primarily down in Italy, and they did do some bombing in Romania and Germany, and our bombing was north of what they did.
Okay. Now, were you assigned a new plane or an old plane when you...
Actually, most of our missions were flown in aircraft that we were not assigned to. We were assigned to an airplane which we called Woo Wagon,
Mm-hmm.
and its designation for identification by the Air Force was S for sugar.
Mm-hmm.
And most airplanes there were identified alphabetically. There was X for X-ray and other initials, that G for George.
Okay.
Those are ones that I remember. There were others which at this point I would have to stop and think or go and look them up.
Okay, so you weren't assigned to just one particular aircraft?
No, we flew I'd say we probably flew a third of our missions in our own ship, which we called Woo Wagon.
Okay.
And other times we were just assigned to an airplane, and we flew that. Our crew stayed together, and there were kind of superstitions about leaving your crew and
Mm-hmm.
flying with another crew. We never, as I recall, none of us ever had to do that, but there were strong superstitions around the base about being called upon to do that. it was something that you did not want to do.
Okay, now your airplane, the Woo Wagon, was that painted in any way, any type of nose art on it?
There was nothing up front other than, I believe S. Sugar was up there and Woo Wagon was painted up there. The tails, as I recall, were had a black stripe across the middle of the tail. There were twin tails on the B-24, and each tail portion had a black stripe across, which identified our group.
Now, did your crew name the plane that, or was that already named?
It was already named, as I recall.
Okay. And did you decorate your jackets at all?
No, no. In fact, we could not get jackets. At that time, leather jackets were a priority, and most of those went to the pilots, navigators, and bombardiers. If, as an ordinary enlisted man, if you had one, you purchased it and paid a big price for it.
Can you describe what your first mission was like?
Our first mission was to a place called Magdeburg, and we were all quite nervous and quite afraid, but if I look in here, our target was a railway bridge which was not visible, and the secondary target was marshalling yards at a place called Hamm, Germany, Hamm. And the mission was very easy. We had no fighter interception and very little, if any, flak. So in spite of our fears, it was a very easy mission. And
how long did that mission last, or how long did a typical mission last?
A typical mission would last anywhere between 4 and 10 hours. The furthest we ever went was to Berlin, or the other side of Berlin, where we were just 12 miles from the Russian lines, and we were given instruction on how to identify ourselves in Russian, and we were issued 45s, which we had to turn in once we returned from the mission.
What was probably your most memorable mission? And by that I mean, was a mission where you were under fire, under attack?
Yes, we...
Any that stands out in particular in your mind?
There's one mission we made where over Switzerland, I remember we saw Lake Constance, and at some point we were not any longer over Switzerland. We had left there, and we lost an engine, so we had to leave the formation. And at that point we were all very nervous because there were German fighter planes below us, but we were picked up by a few P-51 aircraft which escorted us back to the English coast, and at that point they went back over the channel to Germany. But that was the most fearful mission, I guess, that we had because of the German aircraft. Other times we were attacked for the first time by German jet planes, but they could only stay up for a very short time, I think 15 or 20 minutes. They only made one pass at us and then left. At other times we were subject to intense flak over various cities, but we were hit and had holes in the vessel, but we had no injuries, and the only thing we ever did was throw out things in the aircraft which were heavy to keep us from losing altitude.
And how many missions did you fly all total?
I flew 20 missions starting in January until about the middle of April. And at that time we stopped, the entire base stopped flying because the ground crews, the men on the ground, the infantry and tank corps were moving so fast that they didn't know where they were. And so it was very easy for us, we just stopped flying.
So this was April of 45?
In April of 1945, and I started flying in January of 1945, and I was discharged from the service in November of 45. So I spent almost exactly 2 years in the service.
Okay, and going back, do you recall where you were when you heard about the death of President Roosevelt?
We heard it at the base, and that was it. There was not any great amount of sadness. I think had we been back in the United States, feeling would have been different. But on the base, it was something that was reported to us as news, and that was it.
And when you were discharged, what was the highest rank you had attained?
Well, when we went overseas, all of us were staff sergeants, made staff sergeants as flying personnel. And I retained that rank until I was discharged in November of 1945 from Hondo, Texas.
Okay, and where were you when the war in Europe ended?
When the war in Europe ended, I was at the air base in England, and most of our group was sent home. We had to stay for some reason. We were a month later getting back, and we were given a 30-day furlough, and then I was assigned or told to report to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and from there we were assigned to train to go to the South Pacific and be gunners on B-29s. In the meantime, Japan had surrendered and all of our orders were changed. At that point, I was sent to Hondo, Texas, and from there I was discharged under the point system.
Okay.
I received credit for being in 3 battles over in Europe, Rhineland, Central Europe, and Ardennes. And then we received points for citations. I had the Air Medal and 2 oak leaf custards, so between the battles and the oak leaf custards, I had 30 points, and the amount to get discharged that involved me was 55 points, so I had about 25 points for other things, including length of service and things of that nature.
Okay. And let me just ask you, when you came back from being overseas, did you fly home or did you come back by ship?
We flew home from England. We flew from England to Wales, and from Wales to the Canary Islands and off the coast of Portugal, and from there we went to Labrador or Newfoundland, I don't recall which, Gander or Goose Bay, and from there we came home.
What kind of aircraft did you
We
come back
flew a B-24 home, and we carried 10 ground personnel. There were 20 people on the plane.
And you flew back with your whole crew?
Our whole crew came back together, and we landed in Connecticut at Windsor Locks. And from there, we were sent to Fort Devens, and that's where, after our furlough, that's where I was assigned to South Dakota.
Okay. And when you were overseas, did you see any USO shows or, you know, Bob Hope or?
No, I never saw any of those shows. The only celebrity I knew of was Jimmy Stewart, who was a captain at our base and had his own crew, and I had heard about him and Clark Gable, but they had both left before I and our group had arrived at the base. So I only heard stories about them.
Okay.
And there was a great admiration for Jimmy Stewart because he was a captain at the time, had his own crew, and flew whatever missions he was assigned to. That was what I heard about him. And he eventually left our base and went on to become, I think when he was discharged, he was a colonel, a full colonel, and had some role in the upper echelons of the Air Force in England.
I think I recall reading that he stayed in the Air Force Reserve and he ended up retiring as a brigadier general many years later.
That probably is correct. I'm sure it's correct. I just had his picture in some books that I purchased when I left the service. The adjutant of our air base published the books, and he had a lot of photographs that he put in them. And the books was available to us with a roster of every mission that the group flew, along with the roster of all the personnel that were in it.
Now, once you were discharged, did you make use of the GI Bill?
I went to college for 2 years. I tried to go to Holy Cross College in Worcester, but they were full with GIs, and the only way you could get in there was if you had a father or a brother who had gone there, and I did not meet those requirements. I went to a small college in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I studied accounting, and from there I came to New York State. I met my wife at college, and we were married and came back to Glens Falls.
What year were you married?
We were married in 1947.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. And have you kept in contact with your fellow crew members?
No, the only fellow crew member I saw was a fellow who was just an ordinary waist gunner like myself. His name was Richard Ramp, R-A-M-P. He lived in Indiana, and he and his wife were visiting the East Coast, and he stopped to see me in Glens Falls. I tried to look up our pilot, our co-pilot, and navigator, not the pilot. The pilot was from Boston, and I don't know what happened to him. He was a pre-med student at the time we were flying. But I did try and locate our co-pilot, who was from Norwood, New York, because I was working and traveling in New York State, and I also tried to look up our navigator, who was from Elmira, and I was not successful in ever making contact with either one of them, although the navigator did send me shoes that were bronzed. I guess that was a style in those days when my first child was born.
Did you join any veterans organizations?
No, I have never belonged to any veterans organizations, the
Okay.
American Legion nor the Veterans of Foreign Wars.
Have you ever attended any of the 8th Air Force reunions?
No, at one time the 8th Air Force had a reunion in Europe, and it was just a matter of expense that would be involved in going there, because we had just returned from Europe the prior year. And we had spent some time in London on personal visits, and I just had no desire to go back there and to see the base or to see any of that again.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Any reminiscences or stories you can think of? Any humorous events?
No, I recall that our clothes, our GI uniforms there were a few soldiers on the base who ran that as a business on their own, and they would clean our uniforms, the dress uniforms, the pants and coats, by soaking them in Air Force gasoline and then letting them hang out to dry.
Oh,
And we would get them back nice and clean and pressed,
Mm-hmm.
and the smell of gasoline was not present.
Hmm.
They said that was because it was Air Force gasoline. I don't know if that's factual or not.
I'm sure it was probably highly flammable.
Yes, it was. I don't think you'd want to light a match to it. And one other thing I remember, a classmate of mine in Leicester High School, he was in love with being a pilot, and he became a pilot in the Army Air Force and was flying P-47s over in Europe. And at one time, he did come to visit me at the air base and landed the P-47 there, and we were all quite talked about for a couple of days because he had done that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How do you think your military experience had an effect or change on your life?
Well, I think it has made me much more conscious of things that involve this country, particularly where we're involved in war, such as Vietnam, or presently as we're involved in Iraq. And I pay close attention to those situations and have my own opinions about them. Unfortunately, my opinion is not shared by many others that I know. And I think being in the service gives you a different outlook on things that happen to or in this country.
Do you think you would have gone on to college had it not been for your military service and the GI Bill?
My mother wanted me to go to Worcester Tech, and I did try and get into Worcester Tech after I got out of the service. At the same time, I tried to get into Holy Cross and had no success. And Worcester Tech was a much smaller school, and I had no success there either. So I went to a business college for 2 years and studied accounting.
Well, there's one thing I wanted to ask you, I just thought of now. Did you find your flight equipment to be adequate? You probably flew at very high altitudes.
We flew at high altitudes, and they said the temperature at times was 55 degrees below zero. All of our flying was done in what you would call electric suits, and we were kept warm with those, and you hoped that you didn't have to use the bathroom while you were flying. All of our missions were flown at, I'd say, between 25,000 and 35,000 feet, and we had oxygen on at all times. When I think when we were over 5,000 feet, we had to put oxygen on, and there was a joke that you could breathe pure oxygen and get a glow on, similar as you would get from drinking liquor. And we used to try that coming back if we had, well, once we were down on our way back and we're at between 5,000 and 10,000 feet, the pilot would let us turn the oxygen on and use it up, because theoretically we would have no further use for it. And we did that.
Now, did your unit suffer very many casualties?
Well, the unit before I arrived there in 1943, 44, they suffered severe casualties, but and at times they would lose 1/3 of their aircraft, and when you figure there were 9 or 10 men on every airplane, most of those, I'd say half of them were unfortunately killed in action. The other half probably bailed out and were taken as prisoners of war. At the time I was in England, we had planes from our group. We did not have severe losses like they had earlier in the 42, 43, 44 years, where they would lose 1/3 of their aircraft. We would lose, occasionally, we would lose a plane. But I saw planes from other squadrons that were hit by flak and exploded in midair, and we would always try and count the parachutes down below to see how many escaped the aircraft.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Well, it's been my pleasure.
Would you please hold up that photograph and tell me when and where that was taken?
This was taken,
I'm getting a little bit of glare. If you can just angle it a little bit. Okay, that's better.
this photograph was taken perhaps in 1943, late 43 or early 44, when I was home on furlough after completing armament school. At that time we were all made, I don't know if I have any stripes on in this photograph or not, but we were given promotions at the time, and I believe at the time this photograph was taken, I was a 3-stripe sergeant. and when we went overseas, we were all promoted to Staff Sergeant.
Okay, and you also have a book there. Is that a yearbook?
This is it's a booklet, contains the address and the missions of, actually I have two books. This one has a mission record, and the first mission our group made was on December 13th, 1943, to Kiel Aircraft. There were 15 aircraft taken off, 12 attacked the target. They carried 500 general purpose bombs, and we lost no aircraft. From that time on, we lost, in February 1944, we were bombing a place called Gotha, Germany, with 500 general purpose bombs, and we lost 13 aircraft out of 25. So we lost half of the group at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But while we did serve and sustained heavy losses, it was misleading because at the time we were putting the German people and the German Air Force in a position where they realized they were at a strong disadvantage, and we were constantly having a battle between the higher-ups in Washington and those in England as to whether we would continue daylight bombing or do night bombing as the British did.
Mm-hmm. And I see you also kept, is that a diary or a logbook?
This is a diary that I kept of my 20 missions, and I recorded generally the name of the airplane we were flying, where we went, and any results that were good or bad as far as flak or fighter interception.
Mm-hmm.
And I see here on our second mission, we saw 2 B-24s go down. One of the most dangerous parts of flying was getting in formation before you actually took off over the channel. We would circle around constantly for 2 hours getting in our position in the formation, and then it would take off, and there were gradually aircraft taking off after we were on our way. They would get in formation, and there was just a succession of aircraft joining the formation until in the latter part of our bombing we were sending over 1,200 to 1,500 aircraft, and probably every bomb group in East Anglia, which is what they call that northeast portion of England where we were, would have airplanes taking off and participating in the bombing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, also I wanted to ask you, most of the aircraft that you flew, were they, the airplanes themselves, were they the bright metal, or were they painted or camouflaged?
They were painted, most of them, as I recall, were painted the official Army color, which they called olive drab.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, they had a black tail marking across the tail, but the airplanes were painted a dull color so that they theoretically would not give off any reflection or do anything to assist the anti-aircraft gunners on the ground.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure.